Think of the last time you introduced yourself to someone. More than likely, you were asked, "What do you do for work?" The saying, "work to live, not live to work," prioritizes a balanced life where your job supports your own personal goals and activities, but for many of us, we are defined by our careers. Now imagine being stripped of all of your professional credits, accolades, and yes, even that one time you won Employee of the Month. All of it gone. And now imagine that this is happening publicly, in front of the entire company, your family, your friends, and you don't even get the chance to defend yourself. Not ideal. Well, a very long time ago, this was the reality for one man, and not just any man, but a man whose personal identity was inextricably linked to his job. The Pope. Pope Formosus, to be exact. And in a public display in January of 897 AD, the reputation of Pope Formosus was ripped to shreds by his successor, Pope Stephen VI. That alone might make this story interesting, right? But what takes it to an absurd level is that, while this was happening, Pope Formosus was dead. That's right, the Pope's dead, rotting corpse was verbally ripped to shreds, his reputation and life's work openly challenged in one of the church's most sacred buildings. It's like Weekend at Bernie's, but set in the Roman Catholic Church. This is the Cadaver Synod, the story of a man who might be considered the first person to be a martyr for what he did in death rather than in life. But before we get to the infamous post-mortem trial, to the severed fingers, the flesh-rotted corpse itself, and the healing waters of the Tiber River, we must first go back to the late 800s. And before we do that, I want to mention again that this is a continuation of the spooky season. All the creepy and extra weird stories we can find for Halloween. So if you came for that, then bear with me as I get into some of the history of the Catholic Church at the time and what made this trial take place in the first place. But before I do that, I would like to thank the sponsor that lets me talk about dead popes for a living. Haha, dead popes for a living. I didn't mean to do that. That was cute. As someone whose hair grows back faster than he can cut it, I can tell you that shaving is annoying. And most shaving companies don't make it any easier. Between overpriced multi-blade cartridges and razors that either cut you or don't cut at all, it makes a frustrating task even worse. But now, you can shave stress-free, thanks to today's sponsor, Hinson Shaving. Hinson's design is simple, and it does that design the best. Instead of multiple razors or springs or some kind of wiggle mechanic that's more flashy than anything, and that, you'll end up throwing in a landfill one day, Hinson's aluminum razors are made with aerospace levels of tolerance. And the design is simple, as you simply take a razor blade and place it between the two pieces of the head of the razor, and then you just screw that part onto the base. The razor's designed with such precision that the blade itself only sticks out a few micrometers past the surface of the head, meaning you can use a direct action sharp razor that doesn't stick out far enough to cut your face, which leads to a cleaner cut and less irritation to your skin. I mean, Hinson's backed with NIRS imaging to measure skin irritation, a test that's unheard of in shaving but shows that Hinson cuts hair the best while damaging your skin the least. Hinson proves that a simple design done well tends to work the best. And it's what you get when you have a razor designed by machinists, not marketers. So if you're looking to get in on this amazing product, then now's the perfect time. That's because right now, if you head to the link in the description at hinsonshaving.com/Wendigang, along with your Hinson razor, you will get 100 free blades. That is right, 100 free razor blades along with your purchase of a Hinson razor. Again, that's head to hinsonshaving.com/Wendigang to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all for watching the ad, and thank you to Hinson for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description. We are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So, in the late 800s, the city of Rome was a shell of its former self. But towards the end of the 9th century, the church was starting to become valued as a secular political prize. Various parties fought over the role of the Pope, which was embodied in the seat of the Grand Pontiff to legitimize or delegitimize political houses and their feuds. This throne of Christendom and its accompanying political leverage passed from faction to faction with all of the predictability of a knife fight. Even the papacy itself had changed from a purely spiritual position that represented the unified body of Christendom into a deadly game of betrayal and ambition. Powerful Roman families, such as the Dukes of Spoleto in our case, lobbied for influence with other rival houses in the city and across Europe. These influential parties' machinations had turned the Pope's seat into an extension of their aristocratic dominance. Even the election process became less about piety or holiness, as it had previously been, and became more about placing a lackey on the throne, which during this time was often bought. The idea was for this lackey to become useful in securing power, extracting loyalty, and defending secular interest with the full weight of divine sanction. Maybe that's part of the reason why, eventually, the body of electors in charge of selecting the next pope would become more precisely defined, thus forming the College of Cardinals, to prevent the pope, a position of holiness, from becoming a political chess piece. However, at the point in time we're talking about, before the college was formed, popes and bishops were chosen by the consensus of both the clergy, which is the church leadership, and the diocese, or in other words, the baptized members of the church. The issue with the latter group is how easily they could be influenced by powerful families, including, as mentioned earlier, the Dukes of Spoleto. The clergy had the divine authority to help make these elections, and the belief was that they were not corruptible like everyday church members. The divine sanction, which drove the papacy's power, was at the center of the maelstrom taking place in the European peninsula at the time. Holy Roman emperors like Charlemagne, Otto the Great, and Lambert of Spoleto clung to imperial titles that offered little actual control over the Italian mainland. It was therefore extremely important to those vying for the throne that holy direction stabilize a church and its people, a people which had become fractured by overlapping claims to authority. Resulting from this ambiguity, a power vacuum was created in which the Pope became both pawn and player. Ambitious candidates jockeying for the papacy realized they needed additional strength from secular leaders and thus aligned themselves with those they felt would give them the best shot. Or, the way companies work today with every politician ever. And this was the case for prospective emperors as well. They would manipulate popes in order to solidify political power and expand their dominion. It was during this political storm that Pope Formosus came into power. Before his ascension to the office of being a pope, not his ascension to heaven, I think. Before his ascension, his predecessors had suffered relatively short terms and pretty gruesome deaths. Pope John VIII was assassinated in 882 by his own clerics after a decade-long papacy. His successor, Pope Marinus I, only served 2 years before his death. Marinus' successor, Pope Adrian III, served 1 year before dying under strange circumstances that led many to believe he was also assassinated. And the fates of subsequent popes around this time included Stephen VI, who was strangled, Leo V, allegedly strangled, John X, allegedly smothered with a pillow, John XII, allegedly murdered by the angry husband of the woman with whom he was in bed with. Really, it wouldn't be until the mid-11th century, under reforms started by Pope Leo IX and others, that the church would regain a measure of its moral and political authority. But between 872 and 965, a span of less than a century, over 20 popes would rise and fall, some with reigns lasting only days. Historians called this period Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Ages of the papacy. It was a time when Rome's spiritual head was often selected more by force of arms rather than faithful adherence to the church's doctrine. The once structured system of leadership and authority in the Catholic Church was now a series of steps that often resulted in execution, exile, or political murder. Once the teacher of the nation, Rome had become a circus of horror and mockery. And while many succumbed to the pitfalls of the chaos, two men used it as a ladder to climb to power. And they are Pope Formosus and Stephen VI. So let's get some background on the people we're going to be talking about. Formosus, born around 816 in Rome, rose through the church's ranks to become the cardinal bishop of the city of Porto in 864. And to note, that is Porto, a Roman suburb, not the city in Portugal. And his path to become pope was full of political obstacles. In the 870s, Formosus was excommunicated by Pope John VIII, who accused him of deserting his diocese without papal permission and conspiring against the Pope. In other words, the Pope accused him of leaving his followers and scheming. While that might not sound like a big deal now, these were serious allegations at the time, as it meant that Formosus abandoned his post as Bishop of Porto, essentially leaving the clergy and church members without their shepherd. This was forbidden by canon law unless the Pope himself gave permission. From the church's perspective, Formosus left Porto without papal authority in the secular sense, and without a representative of God to protect their souls in the spiritual sense. Pope John VIII also accused Formosus of seeking another see, a term for a territory or jurisdiction, as the Archbishop of Bulgaria. According to canon law, bishops and deacons were not allowed to wander into neighboring cities to officiate. This was intended to prevent bishops from building up their own fiefdoms. Or in other words, you don't want bishops or church leaders going around gathering up their own following without the church's permission. Because at this time, people tended to get into wars over that kind of thing. This practice, known as pluralism, was a form of corruption rampant during the medieval period, due in part to the tremendous amount of wealth and power that came with lands belonging to the Christian church. Moreover, a bishop that held multiple sees also resulted in non-residency, since one person could not be in several places at a time. This meant that spiritual duties were either neglected or left to underpaid and poorly trained substitutes, which of course negatively impacted the pastoral care provided to the faithful. This is what John VIII had accused Formosus of doing. Despite being a successful missionary renowned for spreading Catholicism throughout Bulgaria, Formosus's reputation was impacted by these accusations, as you can imagine, as well as his refusal to return to Rome when summoned by Pope John VIII. Not showing up to your own accusation on the Pope's demand is certainly a guilty look, but also relatable. I mean, this guy's boss really had it out for him. In regards to the conspiracy charge, Pope John VIII believed that Formosus had aligned himself with hostile nobles and foreign claimants and was using his influence to undermine papal policy to his own benefit. Papal policy. That's a good word. 2 words. Yeah. Scholars such as Johann Peter Kirsch believe that Pope John VIII viewed Formosus as a potential rival, as Formosus was considered a strong candidate for the papacy as early as 872, the first year of Pope John VIII's tenure. So, he had Formosus excommunicated. But as mentioned, that's just a theory, a game theory, and it seems that John's paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified. As I mentioned earlier, John VIII was the first pope to be murdered by his own people. One day, someone poisoned him. But since the poison was apparently taking too long to take effect, the culprit lost patience and bashed John VIII's head in with a hammer. Pope Marinus I succeeded John and reinstated Formosus as Bishop of Porto. Perhaps realizing what an opportunity this second chance was, Formosus served diligently for several years, after which he was elected pope. This was a remarkable turnaround, from exile to the top of the church's pecking order. Maybe his reputation wasn't as besmirched as people thought, or perhaps this was a reflection of the changing political and religious dynamics in Rome and across the Christian world. When Formosus took the papacy in October of 891, he was faced with a dilemma. He was extremely distrustful of the current reigning emperor, Guy III of Spoleto, and his aggressive expansion policies. Formosus was worried about the fate of Rome, and to make matters worse, Formosus was forced to crown Guy's own son, Lambert, as co-emperor in April of 892. Formosus understood that if he allowed Guy and Lambert of Spoleto to reign, they would exert their political strength onto the Papal States and on Formosus himself. To counter this, Formosus immediately began looking for support against the family and turned his efforts towards Arnulf of Carinthia, who was at the time ruling over East Francia, also known as the Kingdom of Germany. Formosus sent over an embassy requesting Arnulf to come and liberate Italy, promising that Arnulf would be crowned emperor in Rome. It might be surprising to learn, but not only were popes at this time blessing invasions, they were actively summoning them if they felt their position in Rome was compromised. For example, in the mid-700s, Pope Stephen II crossed the Alps and summoned Frankish military campaigns into Italy against the Lombards, an alliance that would give birth to the Papal States. Years later, Pope Hadrian I called on Charlemagne multiple times to intervene in Italy, campaigns which were framed as defending the papal rights. Even Formosus's predecessor, Pope John VIII, called on Charles the Bald to cross the Alps in 875 to claim the imperial crown against locals. Which, yes, a lot of important history talk and whatnot, but most importantly, Charles the Bald, funny name. It took Arnulf a few invasions of Italy to assert his claim to the imperial title, which he finally did so in 896. Arnulf did not go personally in the first invasion, but he did send his sons Ventibold, accompanied by a Bavarian army. Their army defeated Guy, but left later that year. A second request from Pope Formosus forced Arnulf to lead a campaign across the Alps in early 894. Having recently succeeded the German kingship, some scholars believe that Arnulf's consolidated power there gave him the confidence to seize the imperial title as well. Arnulf conquered the territory north of the Po River, forced the surrender of Milan, and drove Guy out of Pavia, a southwestern town in northern Italy. Arnulf halted his assault when a fever incapacitated his troops, then stopped for good after Guy III's sudden death later that autumn. Meanwhile, Lambert and his mother Agiltrude traveled to Rome to receive Formosus' confirmation of Lambert's imperial succession. So Lambert thinks he's going to go to Formosus, and Formosus is going to crown him emperor, not knowing that the war his dad just died in was all because Formosus was trying to get rid of Lambert and his family. When Pope Formosus refused the request to recrown Lambert, obviously, the Pope was thrown in prison by Lambert at Castel Sant'Angelo, also known as the Mausoleum of Hadrian. Lambert of Spoleto was now in control of Rome, but his rule would be short-lived. Keep in mind that Lambert was named co-emperor along with his father by a reluctant Formosus in 892. Arnulf, at the request to aid Formosus, quickly crossed the Alps a second time, again taking control of Pavia. As he gained momentum on the battlefield, his support grew along with it, gaining allies from the nobility of Tuscany, Milan, and Friuli. Although Arnulf found Rome politically locked against him and held by Agiltrude, on February 21st, 896, he took control of the city by force and freed Pope Formosus. Formosus led Arnulf into the Church of St. Peter and, true to his word, anointed and crowned him as emperor. 2 weeks later, Arnulf marched on Spoleto, where Agiltrude had fled to join her son, Lambert. But a sudden stroke left Arnulf paralyzed, forcing him to call off the campaign and return to Bavaria. Rumors spread about the emperor's condition, and many believed he was poisoned by Agiltrude. You know, the mother of the guy he was going to kill, which would make sense. And then, just weeks after crowning Arnulf, Pope Formosus died on April 4th, 896, from what is widely accepted as a stroke. Some sources suggest that he was actually poisoned by supporters of his rivals, the Dukes of Spoleto. This is because some contemporary accounts say that he died in terrible pain. The Dukes of Spoleto had a powerful motive for murder, as there was an intense political conflict between Formosus and the Spoletan faction. Which I think conflict is a little bit of an understatement, considering the Pope had tried to get Arnulf to kill them 3 times now, and Lambert had thrown the Pope in jail for not making him emperor. I would say, yeah, they probably didn't like each other. Interestingly, Arnulf retained power in Italy only as long as he was actually there. Once Formosus was dead, Lambert seized power once again and ordered the execution of all officials who had been appointed by Arnulf. Riots broke out in Rome, possibly instigated by supporters of the Dukes of Spoleto, who fought Arnulf's supporters over control of Rome. Keep in mind that the government of Rome was essentially ruled by the Pope, who was now dead. Formosus' immediate successor, Boniface VI, was quickly elected to stop these riots. But this was an unusual choice, to say the least, since he had been defrocked twice as a subdeacon and priest, which effectively means fired or demoted, for immoral conduct. So that guy gets made pope. The papal historian Caesar Baronius described Boniface VI as a, quote, disgusting monster guilty of adultery and homicide. Which, you know, it's okay, Baronius, tell us how you really feel. Boniface VI reigned for only 15 days before dying, the culprit most likely being gout, or as some would argue, karma. As a result, Rome was left vulnerable to the Spoletos, who were now led by Lambert, the guy who had a really big problem with the previous pope and everything that went down in Rome. Boniface's eventual successor, which is really just Formosus' successor because Boniface was there for like 2 weeks, the papal successor would find himself in a tricky situation, without an imperial patron in Arnulf and surrounded by Spoleto forces. What started out as a plan to secure Rome from being ruled by the Spoletan party led to the very thing that Formosus feared most, that being the Spoletan party potentially controlling Rome. So let's recap. Europe was in disarray with power struggles everywhere, and a pope's blessing was as good as a golden ticket for ensuring undisputed loyalty and a claim to power for potential emperors. Lambert of Spoleto had been one of those leaders, vying for the throne of the Holy Roman Empire against his biggest rival, Arnulf of Carinthia. Lambert believed the crown was in the bag for him due to his vast influence and fortune, you know, being a nepotism baby, including being named as co-emperor with his father Guy III. So when his father died, it only makes sense that he would now be the sole emperor. But Pope Formosus did not like him and instead facilitated Arnulf's ascension to the throne, which to Lambert, Formosus making Arnulf the new emperor probably felt like the rug got pulled from under him. But now, with both Formosus and his successor, Boniface VI, now dead, and Arnulf basically paralyzed and far from Rome, Lambert returns to the city and takes control of Rome. He facilitates the election of a new pope, who also happens to be an outspoken critic of the late Pope Formosus. Who would have thought? Wow, Lambert, you really hated that old pope, so who's your new pope? Wow, a guy that also really hated the old pope? What are the odds? And now in comes our second main character, or second main pope of this story, Stephen VI, who, until he became pope, was a bishop of Anagni, and ordained by Formosus, possibly against his will, but more on that later. The circumstances of Stephen's election as pope are unclear, but he received backing from one of Rome's most powerful families, the Dukes of Spoleto. With Lambert in charge of Rome, Pope Stephen VI sought to nullify Formosus's decisions, including his prior endorsement of Arnulf. And he did so in a way that was nothing short of insane. Morbid, creepy, dark, twisted, and insane. And with all of these pieces in place, you might be starting to see how this story winds up with a dead pope on trial. In January of 897, Pope Stephen VI conducted the Basilica of St. John Lateran, later known as the Synodius Horrenda, or the Cadaver Synod. 9 full months after the death of Formosus, Pope Stephen VI had his predecessor's corpse exhumed from its tomb and dragged into the Holy Basilica, a highly revered church building within Catholicism. The corpse, Stephen had decided, was to stand trial. The trial was held with Pope Stephen VI acting as prosecutor in the presence of Lambert, the papal court, and also common folk filling the basilica's aisles, curious to get a glimpse of the macabre spectacle. And it was every bit as disgusting and unsettling as it sounds. First, there was the corpse itself. In a strange attempt to make it appear more official, as Formosus would have as if he were alive, the badly decomposing body was covered and dressed with red cloth. According to contemporary historians, Formosus's remains had assumed a strange inclined position due to rigor mortis. His arms splayed out, quote, as if it had just been laid down by an invisible cross. Then there was the smell. The putrid stench of decomposition filled the hall. An almost Costco-sized quantity of incense burned on the braziers inside the basilica in a futile attempt to mask the overwhelming foul odor. The corpse was propped up onto a makeshift throne, covered with the aforementioned red cloth, and a young, terrified deacon was appointed to answer on behalf of the dead pope. Which, again, similar to the bald guy earlier, I just want to take a moment to point out, that's very funny. The new pope, on behalf of the new emperor, just grabbed a random deacon and said, hey, you've got to answer on behalf of that dead body that used to be the pope. I think we should do that at more funerals, to be honest. Just have a designated guy to answer really awkward questions on the dead person's behalf. Predictably, the deacon didn't say much while Pope Stephen screamed at the corpse. As far as the accusations levied from the living pope to the dead pope, the most famous direct quote comes from one attendee, Liutprand of Cremona, who noted that Stephen asked, quote, when you were Bishop of Porto, why did you usurp the universal apostolate of the Roman See in such a spirit of ambition? Something that, as mentioned earlier, Pope John had just accused Formosus of doing. We don't actually know that he did it. So the new pope's basically saying, explain why you're terrible and awful. To once again, a dead body. The dead pope was charged with serious canonical violations, including 1, conspiring against the Holy Roman Emperor while serving as the Bishop of Porto by attempting to overthrow Pope John VIII. 2, perjury, possibly stemming from an oath Formosus was rumored to have taken at a council held by Pope John VIII that was basically an effort to funnel more money into Rome's coffers. It was at this council where Formosus promised to remain a layman and never return to Rome for the rest of his life, which, he obviously broke by becoming pope. And 3, because he swore an oath to remain a layman, him later serving as a reinstated bishop and subsequent pope was seen as a serious offense to ecclesiastical law and tradition, according to Stephen. Since, he not only lied to others, but broke an oath, which is a pretty serious thing in religious circles. The proceedings were a ghastly scene of dark Gothic comedy, and bishops looked on in horror, confusion, or complicit silence as Stephen shouted at Formosus. Remember that deacon who was appointed to speak for Formosus? Well, according to Liutprand, he was bent down on his hands and knees behind the throne, responding to Stephen as Formosus with predetermined admissions. When Pope Stephen would point at the dead Pope's body and ask him questions, the deacon, crouched behind the dead Pope, would loudly say, "Because I was wicked." I'm not making that up either. That is a quote. That is one of the scripted lines the deacon was told to say beforehand. It's the new Pope talking to the dead Pope and saying, "I think you're awful. I think you stink. I think your Pope game is whack." And then there's a deacon like underneath the dead Pope going, "You're so right. I'm so dumb. You're the best Pope ever, Pope Stephen. I love you." And around them, there's just a room full of people like, wow. The deacon's identity remains unknown to this day, but his role as corpse's advocate was indeed something medieval canon law had never set a precedent for. These forced, planned confessions, as you could imagine, became a crucial point for later critics who viewed the trial as a ridiculous farce. And there was another unprecedented event that occurred during the middle of the trial. An earthquake shook the room. This is one of the weirdest, just so much absurd things happening at once, and then an earthquake hits the building. Probably a sign. If you do believe in God, then he was almost certainly upset by something going on here. As one attendee would recall, quote, "For the stones themselves, extricating such a monstrosity, then cried out with their own voice by knocking against each other. That would more willingly suffer spontaneous ruin than that the Roman Church should remain depressed by so great a scandal." AKA the church was so upset it was going to kill itself. But through the criticism and warning signs, Stephen persisted. And as expected, the trial's outcome was predetermined. And Formosus was, unsurprisingly, found guilty on all charges. Remember, kids, that's why you never represent yourself. Get your dead body to get your deacon to get an attorney. After the verdict, Formosus's papal vestments, the ceremonial garments worn by the Pope, symbolizing holiness and authority, were stripped from his body. And because that apparently wasn't enough, Stephen ordered 3 fingers from Formosus's right hand to be cut off and cast into the Tiber River. Oh no. He was going to use those. What will he do? But the amputation was more than just physical. It was deliberately chosen for its symbolic significance, as clergy used the thumb, index, and middle fingers to perform the Manus Benedictio, the traditional gesture of blessing in Catholic ritual. The finger removal also constituted an act of spiritual and physical desecration, nullifying Formosus's spiritual authority. Stephen VI invalidated all sacramental acts Formosus had performed as Pope, including, and the reason all this happened in the first place, his ordinations, consecrations, and the crowning of emperors. Obviously, the reason Lambert wanted Stephen, the new pope, to do all of this in the first place was to get rid of the legitimacy of the emperor, Arnulf, that Formosus had crowned while they were at war with each other. So, if you destroyed the legitimacy of the previous pope, you destroyed the legitimacy of the people he made emperor. The humiliation of the ritual was designed to desecrate Formosus's body and erase his spiritual legitimacy in the eyes of the people. Historian William S. Monroe believes that the act aimed to prevent the reverence of Formosus as a martyr, which some of the Roman faithful considered him to be, by destroying the physical markers of his sanctity. He wrote, quote, "The enemies of Formosus could not bear the idea of their arch enemy being regarded as a saint." The grotesque parody of Stephen dressing a corpse in papal vestments, only for him to later strip Formosus of these garments of office, was only the beginning. Stephen also sanctioned the destruction of art and portrait commissions by Formosus, mirroring the ancient Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, where disgraced leaders faced posthumous erasure in pre-Christian Rome, which, considering the Nero video, is now the second time I've talked about it on this channel. I was going to say I'm surprised by that, but not really. Then finally, Formosus's papacy was posthumously annulled, shocker, with everything he did during his time as pope now declared invalid. Ironically, this included his ordination of Stephen VI as bishop, which, you know, if everything Formosus did as pope is now wiped out, that includes making Stephen a bishop, which means Stephen would never have got to the place of pope, which means he never would have been able to take away Formosus's popehood, papacy, whatever. So it's like a Catholic version of the whole going back in time to kill your grandfather paradox. Which, even if they did realize that at some point, I doubt they cared. They put a dead body in a robe and then cut off its fingers. I don't think they were thinking about, like, you know, the modern geopolitical factors that would have. Following the trial and subsequent desecration of Formosus's corpse, the remains, now dressed in layperson's garments, were made to suffer even more indignity. According to accounts, quote, blood seemed to be flowing from Formosus's mouth, as if the body was still suffering. Having deposed him, he had the former pope dragged across the basilica and thrown into the river, and gore was flowing out of his mouth onto the pavement. With Formosus's body joining his severed fingers in the Tiber River, Stephen's final act on the matter was finished. Which, that river, by the way, was not an incidental choice. For centuries, the Tiber River was the place where ancient Romans disposed of their most notorious criminals. The water had carried everything from political rivals of emperors and early Christian martyrs, reviled emperors, condemned to damnatio memoriae, that's 3 times now. According to some, the Tiber River was even where the notorious Pontius Pilate met his end. You know, the Roman governor who gave the order to execute Jesus. Not really the same place you would think of a pope to be buried. Pope Stephen VI had symbolically removed Formosus not just from the ranks of pope, but from the entire physical community of the faithful. The Tiber was where you put people you wanted to permanently exile from life, from society, even from memory. However, later that night, with Formosus's corpse in the Tiber River, something incredible happened. According to an author by the name of Auxilius, during the night there was a great thunderstorm, and the level of the Tiber River began to rise. In Porto, a monk of the St. Acontius monastery was warned in a dream by the ghost of Formosus that the former pope's body would be found along the shore. Heeding this warning, monks recovered the body the next day and secretly buried him in the monastery. The man himself was long dead, but rumors spread that Formosus's waterlogged corpse was still performing miracles, with some saying that the Tiber's waters were healing the sick as the severed fingers continued doing the work of God. Contrary to Stephen's intentions, the mutilation of Formosus's body might have actually bolstered the dead man's reputation amongst the faithful. But even worse for Pope Stephen, public disapproval amongst the Roman populace started to grow as word spread of the Cadaver Synod. Rather than cement Stephen's authority, the grotesque theater of the trial unleashed a storm of public backlash. Even in a pretty barbaric era that saw a lot of violence and sacrilege, Formosus's desecration was on another level. The act stunned Roman citizens and was considered by many as a step too far. I would argue a few steps too far, but as long as we arrive at the same point. The high turnover of popes who were imprisoned, blinded, and poisoned, all before Formosus's tenure, had created the factional violence and destabilization in the city. Add to that list the exhuming, trying, and mutilation of the corpse of a holy man and dumping it into the local river, and you add a populace of people who felt compelled to act. All levels of society turned on Pope Stephen VI, seeing him not as a spokesperson and follower of Christ, but as a desecrator of the papal throne. What was supposed to be an assertion of his Christian and political legacy had turned around in a matter of days. The response was so fierce, in fact, that within a month of the Cadaver Synod, Stephen VI was arrested, deposed by a mob, and imprisoned in a dank cell beneath the Lateran, the Catholic cathedral of the Roman diocese. His downfall was as swift as his ascension to power, and in August of 897, Stephen was strangled to death, either on the orders of his political enemies or as an act of retribution from Roman citizens taking matters into their own hands. All in all, Stephen VI was only a pope for 15 months, much of that time effectively spent in jail beneath the church. After his death, the papacy descended into instability. A dark cloud hung over the church, the intertwining of law and horror resulting from the desecration of their former pope had become a symbol for the papacy's decline. That string of popes who suffered gruesome deaths, that was around this time. There was Romanus, who may have attempted to rehabilitate Formosus's memory, Theodore II, who officially annulled the Cadaver Synod and had Formosus's body reburied with honor in St. Peter's, and John IX, who convened a synod which affirmed Theodore II's synod and ordered the destruction of the records of the Cadaver Synod. And then John IX also excommunicated 7 cardinals involved in the Cadaver Synod and prohibited any future trial of a corpse. Which, I've got a better idea. What if we just said no more synods at all? Because we had one that said that the other one was no good, and then we had another one to back up the finding from that one that the original one was no good, and then we had another one to say that no more would happen, where you put a dead corpse on trial. So maybe just chill. Stephen's memory and legacy was now the one that would be damned, his decrees nullified and buried in a mountain of contempt. As for Lambert of Spoleto, the reigning emperor whose influences sparked the Cadaver Synod in the first place, well, he lost his imperial claim. Since, the Pope that said he was emperor was in jail and then strangled. Lambert actually died in a hunting accident in 898, a few months after the trial's undoing. Whether by coincidence or divine judgment, Rome did not seem to care. But why did Stephen carry out the Cadaver Synod in the first place? While traditional explanations blame the Spoleto clan, as you can imagine, with Lambert and his vengeful mother Agiltrude pulling the strings, historian William S. Monroe argued that it was Pope Stephen VI who acted on his own out of desperation and not necessarily out of vengeance or bitterness as one might assume. You see, in Monroe's reading, Stephen had originally aligned himself with Arnulf during the power struggle between Arnulf and the Spoleto party. Back when Formosus got Arnulf to come to Rome to declare war on the Spoletos. With Arnulf paralyzed and Lambert-led Spoletos marching towards Rome, Stephen perhaps saw an opportunity to quickly and strongly signal loyalty by discrediting Arnulf's papal ally, Formosus. Or in other words, Stephen had previously been on the side of Formosus and Arnulf. So when Formosus dies and Arnulf has a stroke and has to leave, and now the Spoletos, your previous enemies, are taking over, he's got to do something quick to switch sides and look convincing while he does it. From this interpretation, then, the trial was a political offering meant to salvage Stephen's position. Monroe suggests that even Lambert may have been displeased with the trial, as he would later confirm Formosus's ordinations that were previously invalidated by Stephen VI. That means Lambert, the guy who Formosus had refused to crown and Lambert had thrown in jail, Lambert would later say that that guy's position as Pope was legitimate, which is a far cry from what Stephen said about him on trial. Joseph Durr, a Luxembourg clergyman and writer, pointed out that Lambert would attend the Ravenna Council in 898, in which the decrees of the Cadaver Synod were revoked. At this council, Lambert actively approved of the nullification. Had he wanted the Cadaver Synod to happen in the first place, or had he carried a grudge, it's unlikely he would have so enthusiastically championed the rewriting of it, according to Durr. Now, on the other hand, I think it's also possible that it may have been a play to appeal to a Roman populace who clearly did not approve of these proceedings, and Stephen merely took all the blame. Either Stephen, now Pope, needs to do something to gather Lambert's favor really quick, so he decides to put the Pope that he assumes Lambert doesn't like on trial and remove his, office as Pope. Or it was Lambert and Stephen's idea, and then when everyone in Rome didn't like it a lot all at once, Lambert decides to switch sides, say it was all Stephen's idea, and then during the Ravenna Council in 898, say that he never liked it in the first place and they shouldn't talk about it. Somewhere in there, someone switched sides. Another interesting theory on Stephen's motives comes from Elizabeth Harper in Atlas Obscura. She suggests that Stephen desecrated Formosus' corpse because he was trying to cover up the fact that he was also guilty of the exact same things he was accusing Formosus of. Remember how Formosus ordained Stephen a bishop? Well, when Stephen became pope, he also became Bishop of Rome. The title comes with the papacy. This meant that Stephen was the bishop of two places, Anagni and Rome, which, if you'll remember, is a big no-no and one of the things that Stephen accused Formosus of, as John VIII had also accused Formosus of. But perhaps most on point and much more succinctly, Harper offered what might be the best way of summarizing this entire story. Quote, Stephen also might have been completely insane, which, yeah, that's probably in the mix somewhere too. The trial of a pope's corpse carried a message far beyond canon law. The Cadaver Synod was not only about church or politics, but also about memory and sanctity of a legacy. It was a declaration about where authority lives and who gets to write history. As Monroe wrote, quote, the best explanation, then, of the Cadaver Synod is that Formosus was considered by some people in Rome to be a very holy man, and even, perhaps, a martyr. Desecrating the body and putting it on trial, they hoped to stain the former pope with damnatio memoriae. But in case even that failed, they disposed of the body itself. To leave no relics and no tomb around which a cult could be sustained. Pope Stephen VI tried to retroactively cancel his predecessor's entire legacy, and in doing so, exposed the church and himself. If Formosus ordinations could be declared null by one pope, one man, then so too could the bishops Formosus had appointed, the emperor Formosus had appointed, and the policies he had helped shape. I should also mention that 10 years later, Pope Sergius III allegedly had Formosus's corpse exhumed once more, and yes, once again had it tried, found it guilty, and had it beheaded. The headless cadaver was supposedly once again thrown into the Tiber, where it became entangled in a fisherman's net. The Vatican would later invalidate the charges and buried the remains, which they somehow recovered from the fisherman's net, I guess, in St. Peter's Basilica. But it's also possible that this second trial of the same dead body never happened, which would explain how they still have the body. The Cadaver Synod reminds us that the church, like anything else that has humans in it, was not immune to spectacle, nor the temptation to rewrite history. The trial endures like other historical anomalies because it reveals something about power, fear, and legitimacy. And, well, probably also because it's just a really weird story. Think of modern political purges where statues are toppled and histories are rewritten and power is justified through symbolic reversal or the selective desecration of what came before. Formosus's desecration was not only meant to invalidate his acts as pope, but to overwrite the entire memory of his rule. Just this year, the election of Pope Leo XIV rehashed conversations about the nature of papal authority, particularly in this age of social media, the polarization of just about everything, and mounting global scrutiny. Thankfully, no recent pope has exhumed his predecessor's corpse for a kangaroo court, although Leo, a Chicago native, is also a White Sox fan, which might actually be worse. That is a joke that hopefully one person found funny. I know nothing about baseball. And while us non-popes don't necessarily dig up the bodies of our dead enemies, we sometimes do scroll far back enough on the timeline to screenshot old tweets and put them on trial in the court of public opinion. And Stephen VI sought to reshape the past, but in doing so ended up being condemned by it. So this entire story is an allegory for cancel culture, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, that's it. If you take nothing else away from it, take that, I guess. Look, if I didn't take high concept stories from history or literature and dumb them down to an offensive degree, then it just wouldn't be a Wendigoon video, would it? But regardless, I hope you found it interesting, and I just want to say thank you for watching. This is a weird story I've heard about before, but every detail of it just made it weirder. There was a battle going on, and this guy didn't like this guy, so he gets this other guy to put this guy's body on trial. And then, of course, that poor deacon that had to crawl underneath the dead pope and pretend to be him. Like, where? What? Okay. I certainly enjoyed talking about it, and hopefully you enjoyed listening. Stay tuned for more dark and macabre stories throughout the rest of October, and thank you all so much for the support you've shown on the last video and the rest of the channel and the other channels. It really does mean the world. Everyone who worked on this video and made it possible will be listed in the description, so as always, be sure to show them some love. We certainly appreciate your all's time, and as always, it means the world. I believe that should do it for now. New content on the way, but before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!
No, Pope Stephen, you're so dreamy and beautiful and definitely don't smell bad, like me, the dead Pope. Kiss me, please. This is what I'm doing for money on the internet now. My parents wanted me to go to medical school, but here I am pretending I'm role-playing the deacon underneath a dead Pope from the 800s. This is my job. This is my life. This isn't the Pope or the deacon. This is Isaiah. And this is
This is what I am now. Okay.